Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to talk about, well...
And now, here he is, the star of our show, Dick Clark! Thank you.
That's right, Dick Clark died recently at the age of 83, and everybody knows him. He's been featured on this show a number of times, when we did doo-wop, when we did garage rock, when we did Don Cornelius. What we're going to try and do is, rather than talk too much about his accomplishments, we're going to try and analyze him because he was a very complex character and put him in historical context. The key to understanding Dick Clark is he was the first man to understand television, understand rock and roll, and understand the younger generation. And he was a salesman. His father was a salesman, and he knew exactly what to do. There were people who understood the new medium of television, but they didn't know anything about rock and roll. There were people who knew rock and roll, they didn't know anything about the medium of television, and not too many people, older people at least, knew about the younger generation. People like Ed Sullivan, Steve Allen, who had people like Elvis Presley on, looked at those as vaudeville acts. They didn't look at those in the context of the younger generation. As my friend Jim Nicholson wrote, it's difficult now to make younger generations understand the sheer venom the mainstream media, public politicians, and entertainers had for rock and roll. It was Rome panicking as Hannibal approached the city. End of the world as we know it stuff. Religious zealots wanted to burn people at the stake and did burn records. And Dick Clark was the perfect messenger wading through this vicious hostility. He was a messenger who looked and sounded too angelic to kill. He was the real deal with the clean and sober personal life. Most people who worked with Dick Clark liked him. They said he was a genuine, honest guy, but he was definitely a cold-hearted businessman. And you'll notice in most of the interviews, he's not very forthcoming. He doesn't talk about any of the controversies, doesn't talk about any of the messy stuff. And if you look at his early interviews versus his later interviews, he sanitizes a lot of things. I guess we all do that, but Dick Clark especially. There was a lot of image to him. In fact, that's what he sold. He sold image. But his influence was undeniable. He grew up in Utica, New York. He went to A.B. Davis High School and then on to Syracuse. He shined shoes for money at Syracuse, always looking to hustle a buck. And then he got into broadcasting. And his first influence, I think interestingly enough, was Arthur Godfrey.
I was about 13 seeing that radio show done. I had listened to Arthur Godfrey. I emulated him. I loved him. I adored him because he had the ability to communicate to one person who was listening or watching. Most people would say in a stentorian voice, "Good evening, everyone." Everyone. Godfrey knew there's only one person listening at a time. I learned it from Godfrey. Just be yourself.
Very telling because Godfrey sold sincerity on radio and television. He wasn't especially talented, but everybody loved him because he was sincere. Until he fired Julius Erosa and then had a public tantrum on television, and people realized that the public persona of Arthur Godfrey was not like the private persona of Arthur Godfrey. And I think Dick Clark at the time watched that and realized to keep his private persona very private and never let it show in public. Then came one of the two critical moments in Dick Clark's career. It could have gone the other way for him. He was a newscaster in upstate New York. He, interestingly enough, took over for Bob Earl, who became the host of College Bowl, and then he migrated down to WFIL, which was the big radio station in Philadelphia run by the Philadelphia Inquirer. Today he says he got the job on his own. In the old days he said he got his dad's help. But either way, he was behind a man named Bob Horn. And Bob Horn was the genius behind Philadelphia Bandstand. Bob Horn was the guy who thought to put teenagers on radio and television and get them dancing and getting a rock and roll television show. The problem with Bob Horn is he was 37 years old. He looked like an IBM salesman. He had a drinking problem, and there were allegations of some assignations with young girls who visited the studio. So he was the genius behind Philadelphia Bandstand, which became American Bandstand. But all his problems meant that management couldn't keep him on, and so they were looking for this young, clean-cut guy to take over for him after they get rid of Bob Horn. Here's Dick talking about it, and I don't know if he gave Bob Horn the credit that Bob Horn deserves, because it was Bob Horn who actually started Dick Clark's career at Bandstand.
It was a television show founded by two disc jockeys, Bob Horn and Lee Stewart, in 1952. It was Snyder Musical Films. Snyder Films are old musical videos, if you will, of performance footage in black and white. This station had bought this library, didn't know what to do with it, brought the two guys in and said, "Play it." It's boring. They let the kids from the neighborhood come in. The kids watched, got up and danced. A fellow named Lee Davis, the director, took pictures of the kids dancing, got a lot of phone calls. The films were gone, the kids dancing, the records became probably the most copied television format of the day. And there was no great mind behind any of this. It happened by accident. And eventually I was doing the radio quote version of Bandstand, and the guy, Bob Horn, who was the survivor of that partnership, they split right after a year. He would come in and say, "Hi, it's Bob Horn, Dick Clark," and he'd leave and do the television show. After it was over, he'd come back, have a beer, and say, "Yeah, it was a wonderful afternoon. Talk to you tomorrow," and he'd leave. It was a very odd arrangement. He was a huge, well, not huge, he was a very well-recognized Philadelphia disc jockey, and he was a middle-aged man. The irony here was he never really cared too much for kids, and here he was this idol of kids. They loved him.
Well, that's the story today, but you talk to people then, and Bob Horn was a pretty sharp guy, and it wasn't just an accident. But like I say, he had his problems, and management had to get rid of him. One of them being he might have liked some kids a little too much, and they needed the clean-cut person. Remember, this is during the juvenile delinquent craze, which we talked about before. Enter Dick Clark, and if nothing else, he did take his opportunity and make the most out of it.
I was in my 20s, but I had a teenager's face. I got the job, and I had to get over about 2-3 days of misery with the kids who missed Bob, but we got along real well because I like kids. I genuinely like younger people. To this day, I like people younger than me. It was a good marriage.
Again, the perfect marriage of television, rock and roll, and youth. The 3 keys to the show were the acts that Dick Clark put on, which we'll talk about in a little while, the kids dancing, and the rate a record, which was essentially a simple quiz show that were popular in the 50s. Here's some of the kids who were actually American Bandstand dancers 50 years ago.
I feel very privileged to have been a part of that. Some girls in my class came to me one day and they said, "We went to that bandstand yesterday. We had a blast. Why don't you come?" And I'm only 12 years old. I said, "I'll never get in." I said, "Oh, yeah, we'll make you up. We'll blacken your eyes and fluff you up and you'll get in."
And I came home from school one day and saw her dancing. And I said to myself, well, isn't that the cat's meow? I'm going to go up there and dance with her. And I went up and I asked her to dance. And she said she wouldn't. I said, "You got to be kidding." I said, "Come on." "No, I got a boyfriend." So I think I danced with Arlene and a couple other girls that I had asked, and they were more open about, okay, fine. Toward the end of the show, I asked her, I said, "Well, look, I danced with all your girlfriends. When am I going to get to dance with you?" And she says, "Okay." So we danced. And it was like we had danced, I swear, all our lives together. And we're still young kids then.
These kids that came to the show, they came from all different sections of the city. You had West Philadelphia, you had South Philadelphia, you had the North Philadelphia, and everybody had their own way of dancing. South Philly danced one way, and North Philadelphia had their own style. Everybody had their own style.
Then there was Rate a Record, and here Dick Clark talks about one of the first black kids he had rating a record. American Bandstand did help integrate daytime television. Dick Clark claims it was sort of an accident, but nothing he did was an accident. I have a feeling there was a calculated maneuver to it, but he should be given credit for that.
I get a call from a guy in Philadelphia, a black friend of mine, Georgie Woods. Georgie Woods, the man with the goods. We'd talk 3-4 times a week. He'd tell me what the black kids like. And I said, "Well, if the black kids like it, I don't know the white kids will like it." And it worked. And I can remember some vivid recollection I had. The very first time ever in my life, I talked to a black teenager on national television. It was in what we call the Rate a Record portion of Bandstand, which is a dance show, kids dancing. They listened to the records and gave a rating. It's the coiner of the phrase, "I like the beat, it's easy to dance to," which became part of Americana. But talked to the black kid, show was over. I mean, it's the first time in 100 years I got sweaty palms.
Mike, we'll go to you first. We'll break precedent. We should do ladies first, but June, you've done it before, so we'll give Mike a shot in.
Okay, I rated it a 90 because I like the tambourine in it and the cymbal beat.
Think it'll be a hit?
Yes, I do. I think it'll be a real big hit.
Obviously, a 90, you liked it. June, did you agree, disagree?
I agreed. I rated it 85, and I thought the tambourine came out real good, and you can dance to it. It has a nice beat to it.
Fair enough. We have a 90, and let's see, 90, 85?
87 and a half.
Stealing your only line that you had there.
Again, basically a mini quiz show which people loved in the 50s. Well, American Bandstand took off, and within 5 years, Dick Clark was about the biggest thing in the country. You know you're big when Ralph Edwards does you on This Is Your Life.
Dick Clark, This Is Your Life, the life of one of today's outstanding television personalities. As master of ceremonies of 2 nationally televised record and dance shows, American Dance Band on weekdays from Philadelphia, and the Dick Clark Show on Saturday nights from New York City, you have a combined weekly audience of let's say 50 million Americans at least, and you receive 50,000 letters a week from your teenage fans, which you answer through your Sunday column in This Week magazine. Circulation almost 12 million.
Yeah, that's how big Dick Clark was, but then came the second juncture in his career, the second thing that could have derailed him, and you don't hear much about it today. Dick Clark was involved in the payola scandals of the late 50s. And there's very little question that Dick Clark was guilty in a sense. He had illegal conflicts of interest by owning record performers, some label things. He could put music on and promote it. It was illegal, but everybody was doing it at that point. As Jim Nicholson points out, though, we just gone through the McCarthy scares, the Kefauver hearings about the mob. We had the problem with juvenile delinquency. And what did the government decide to do? They decided to go after music and performers and DJs. In any event, somehow Dick Clark, probably because of his clean-cut image, managed to escape unscathed despite a lot of evidence that he was involved. And it's a good question. Why did someone like Alan Freed, who wasn't a clean-cut guy, get nailed and Dick Clark didn't? And I think a lot of it had to do with that clean-cut image, which is interesting because then Dick Clark moved into movies, and the movie he selected was Because They're Young, which burnished his image right as he was undergoing the payola scandals. It's the story of a teacher who's just older than his students who comes to mentor them. And the music was done by Duane Eddy, who coincidentally had his contract in large part owned by Dick Clark. The undercurrent here is we want to get middle America away from thinking about juvenile delinquency.
Here are every parent's joys and panics, every girl's fears and hopes, every boy's drives and dreams.
It's all right. You think it's such an honor to wear this ring and go find some girl who's willing to pay rent.
What, troubles, Jim? How about that, Ricky? She's supposed to be in love with me, and she won't even wear my class ring. She wouldn't? Why not? Look, I've heard of doctors' wives hating the patients.
I am not jealous of your friendship with the students. I'm afraid of it. For you and for me. You're going to get hurt. I can't stop you.
Because They're Young, starring Dick Clark in his first dramatic challenge, co-starring Michael Callan, one of Hollywood's bright new young stars, Tuesday Wells, Roberta Shore, the lovely girl from The Shaggy Dog, and guest stars James Darren, and Duane Eddy and the Rebels. The younger people will never forget it. The people who are young will always remember it.
Yeah, bottom line, Dick Clark wasn't much of an actor. That was the end of his acting career for all intents and purposes. But the movie burnished his image, got America away from thinking that juvenile delinquency and rock and roll were associated, and helped him push Duane Eddy and to a certain extent James Darren. Beautiful business move. Dick Clark became a multimillionaire in the 60s through Bandstand, and then in the early 1970s he took on his next challenge, and it was an audacious one too. He took on New Year's Eve, Guy Lombardo. It had always been Guy Lombardo's province with his Royal Canadian Band to bring in New Year's Eve since the Depression.
Harry, it looks as though we started way back in the Depression days, and I was in the 30s. And we used to broadcast from the Roosevelt Hotel on the Coast to Coast network. As a matter of fact, two networks. We'd close CBS, open NBC. And All Lang Syne, of course, came right in the middle of it, and we finished CBS by playing All Lang Syne and opened up NBC by going into it. So it's been a long, wonderful many years of Happy New Years. We played all through the Depression era. We played through the World War II period and after the war, and then we switched to television. And that's been going on now for the last 14 years.
In the early 1970s, that's what New Year's Eve sounded like for the Geezers, and here's what Dick Clark did with it.
You see the year 1973 just flashing briefly. When it hits there, you can bet your bottom dollar it'll be pandemonium. Before it all happens, let me wish you the happiest of all New Year's, and watch out. It is now 1973 as of now.
Dick Clark turned it into Rockin' New Year's Eve, and ironically, ultimately, he became Guy Lombardo. He made more millions. He became a multi-millionaire through his blooper shows, his other syndication shows, but his biggest legacy will be the groups he introduced on Bandstand, or gave big breaks to. Here are the 50s. One of the things he introduced was the Stroll by the Diamonds.
Come, let's stroll across the floor. Come, let's stroll across the floor.
The great singer Johnny Ray introducing Connie Francis.
I personally feel that this young, beautiful, charming, talented girl is going to be one of our top stars.
Johnny, I think you're right. Let's turn her over to the folks and see what happens. The MGM recording star, Miss Connie Francis, with Who's Sorry Now?
Ed Sullivan may have had a problem with Elias Otha Bates, a.k.a. Bo Diddley, but Dick Clark sure didn't.
Put it in the bottom and it goes. Make it pretty, baby, run it goes. Put it in the bottom and make it pretty, baby, it's Sunday.
And then there was the one and only Little Richard, and white America hadn't seen anything like him before. In the 60s, Clark moved out to LA and picked up on the Beach Boys. He made a deal with Berry Gordy and got Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross, the Supremes. Every once in a while, you get a little surrealism. Here's my old friend Captain Beefheart, who we did recently with a telephone interview.
Well, who do we have today here?
Hello, Jake. This is Captain Beefheart of the Magic Band.
Captain Beefheart, hold on a second. May I have your name and age?
Kathy Fletcher, 17.
Captain, this is Kathy with question number 1.
Who thought of the name of the group?
I thought of the Captain Beefheart, and the rest of the group thought of the Magic Band.
And of course, the Queen of Soul.
This is the number 1 song.
In the 70s, Karen Carpenter. Elton John and Kiki D. And in the 80s, people like Kim Carnes and Blondie.
Blondie.
Her hair is hollow gold. Her lips sweet surprise. Her hands are never cold. She's got Betty Davis eyes.
Well, that, of course, is just a brief mention of some of the stars that he featured. We didn't even mention his American Music Awards, which took on the Grammys and brought them into the 21st century. We didn't mention Ryan Seacrest, who he made a star. So Dick Clark did a whole bunch of stuff that we couldn't even get to today. A complex character, very successful businessman, something of an enigma, but someone who influenced our history, our society, and our culture. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with Bandstand Boogie by Barry Manilow and a brief mention by his protege, Ryan Seacrest. I don't care how old you are, you're young when you hear this.
We're going hopping today, when things are popping, a Philadelphia way, we're gonna drop it, on all the music they play on the bandstand. Mr. Dick Clark, what a place you got here, swell spot, the music's hot here, best of the East, give it at least a 75, and we'll rock and roll and stroll on American Lindy Hop and Slop, it's American.
ladies and gentlemen.